Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Anástasis Center channel here on YouTube. My name is Mako Nagasawa. I'm the director, and we are continuing in our series on the theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Here's where we've been so far. In session one, we did a quick introduction to Tolkien. What were his purposes in writing? Number two, we talked about the portrayal of God and the traces of God, the activities of God as it plays out in Tolkien's legendarium, primarily Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, but also referring to the Silmarillion. And we compared that to Christian theology and the portrayal of God. How does it make sense to have a good God and yet there also be evil? So that is the question of theodicy. What kind of God is this? And if God is good, then how is God going to defeat evil without becoming evil himself? Huge question. We talked about the role of humanity. What is our identity in the story? Why is it that the God requires partnership or calls for partnership from us? How come the story of good triumphing over evil requires human participation? Number four, we looked at the hero's journey and the defeat of evil as atonement and salvation. And now we're going to look at ethics and epistemology. I thought about how to do this separately, but we are going to combine ethics and epistemology together. What is the right thing to do, and how do we know? And there'll be different things that we take a look at. So today, we're going to look at probably the most challenging questions that Tolkien raises as far as the story goes. Why destroy the ring? Why march on Mordor? And why pity Gollum? So those of you who know the story know that these are three huge questions that the heroes face, and they are not easy to answer. They are really hard questions, not just to carry out, but to actually understand why that was the right thing to do. So let's look at the question, why destroy the ring? Now, to understand this, we have to look back at the chapter called the Council of Elrond, where Elrond and Gandalf and the Fellowship, as well as others, have a meeting and discuss what to do with the One Ring now that it is lying before them in Rivendell. Elrond says, well, we cannot use the ruling ring. That we now know too well. It belongs to Sauron and was made by him alone, and is altogether evil. Its strength, Boromir, is too great for anyone to wield at all, save only those who have already a great power of their own. But for them, it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. As we have already seen when Gandalf says that, the way to my heart is through pity, and the ring will deceive me, and I will deceive myself out of a desire to do good, but then the ring will corrupt me. So it seems like no one's really safe here. Elrond continues, consider Saruman. If any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another Dark Lord would appear. And that is another reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be a danger even to the wise. For nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. I fear to take the ring to hide it. I will not take the ring to wield it. The whole reason why Sauron put his life and force and essence into the ring was because he believed no one would destroy it. Everyone would want to use it. So the only way to actually destroy Sauron is to destroy the ring. But even that was not a 100% assured thing. And here Glowin asks, but what then would happen if the ruling ring were destroyed, as you counsel? We know not for certain, answered Elrond sadly. I want to underscore that because in the movies, it seems like it's a certainty that Sauron would instantly die or dissipate or whatever. In the book, they weren't even sure of that. And then there were other implications. Some hope that the three rings, the three elven rings, which Sauron has never touched, would then become free, and their rulers might heal the hurts of the world that he has wrought. But maybe when the one has gone, the three will fail, and many fair things will fade and be forgotten. That is my belief. Yet all the elves are willing to endure this chance, said Glorfindel, if by it the power of Sauron may be broken and the fear of his dominion may be taken away forever. Notice again the if, like if by it the power of Sauron may be broken. They're willing to endure a chance. Here's another huge question that the heroes face after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Aragorn is leading the forces, and he is in Gondor. And the question then is, should we march on Mordor? The reason why they're considering this is they consider the possibility that Frodo and Sam might have to take the ring across Mordor through the plains of Gorgoroth. But how in the world would they do that when it is infested and crawling with orcs? The only way is to actually lure all of Sauron's attention and army towards them. And so Aragorn says his doubt will be growing even as we speak here. His eye is now straining towards us, blind almost to all else that is moving. So we must keep it. Therein lies all our hope. This then is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly, it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it, we cannot by force defeat his force, but we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. In other words, we can distract him. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring bearer his only chance, frail though it be. We must make ourselves the bait. Though his jaws should close on us, he will take that bait in hope and in greed. For he will think that in such rashness he sees the pride of the new ring lord, and he will say, so he pushes out his neck too soon and too far. Let him come on, and behold, I will have him in a trap from which he cannot escape. There I will crush him, and what he has taken in his insolence shall be mine again forever. So Aragorn knows, because he's looked into the Palantir and he's confronted Sauron through the seeing stones, the Palantir, that Sauron believes that he has the ring, because Sauron believes he has the Hobbit that had the ring, even though that was all a mistake. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So Aragorn is going to lure Sauron out of Mordor and lure all of his forces out in the hope that Frodo and Sam would be able to cross the plains and get to Mount Doom and throw the ring into the fire. They don't know that Frodo and Sam are alive. It's a guess as far as they can tell. It's not an unreasonable guess. It is an educated guess. And that has to do with, well, if Sauron did have the ring, they would certainly know it. There would just be fireworks going on all over Mordor. So they reason it out. Like, well, Sauron doesn't have the ring, so it hopefully means that Frodo is still on his way and is just waiting to figure out a way to get across. So we know that we couldn't wield the ring. We also know that if we don't give Frodo a chance now, we'll die anyway. So the only possibility left for victory is to do this. Insane. And then the big question that confronted Frodo and Sam, why pity Gollum? Now, at the beginning of the story, Gandalf is telling Frodo about Gollum and about the ring. And he talks about pity. And he talks about how Bilbo showed pity on Gollum. Frodo questions that and says, it's a pity that he didn't kill Gollum. And Gandalf replies, pity. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. I am sorry, said Frodo, but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum. You have not seen him, Gandalf broke in. No, and I don't want to, said Frodo. I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc, and just an enemy. He deserves death. Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. In any case, we did not kill him. He is very old, very wretched. The wood elves have him in prison, but they treat him with such kindness as they can find in their wise hearts. Oh, it's so portentous. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. Now, we know the end of the story. We know how absolutely true that is because of the eucatastrophe and how evil consumes itself. It could have played out differently, but it did play out this way. And in that sense, Frodo and Sam were victorious. They were successful because they did show pity on Gollum. But how did they know? That is the really challenging and troubling thing here. And epistemology refers to a branch of philosophy where you have to understand, how do we know things? How is legitimate knowledge legitimate? So what does that look like in Tolkien? So there are consistently two sets of ethics being presented to us. There is a received morality, which is based on hearing and hope, which has to do with integrity and loyalty, keeping your vows, fellowship. That kind of received morality comes from a human standpoint, it comes from the elves, and then from the elves, it actually comes from the Valar, the angelic beings who are hearing from Eru Ilúvatar. And, they have to sort out, okay, is this a lie from Melkor or what here? Or is this a lie from Sauron? But the other framework for ethics is, we would call it consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is based on sight and calculation. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at a few instances. First, let's look at Saruman. Now, Saruman tries to use the Palantir, which of course is a device of sight. The Palantir, there were 7 seeing stones, kind of like crystal balls of different size, made by Feanor, that's talked about in the Silmarillion, and they can contact one another. And so, because Sauron possesses one of these things, Saruman tried to make contact with him. He actually did, but he wasn't wise in doing that, and he wasn't really the true user of the Palantir anyway. And so Saruman sees the size of Sauron's army. He sees all these things that Sauron wants to show him, because Saruman can't just read Sauron's mind. And out of this, Sauron persuades Saruman to join forces with him. Saruman thinks there's just no hope for elves and humans in Middle-earth. The best thing that we could do as the wizards, as the Istari, which is try to help people resist Sauron, is to actually just try to help them survive. And so he compromises his commission and says, like, well, we have to reevaluate that. We have to redefine what our mission is. And yet, as we know, this is how Saruman failed. He saw things, he saw some things, but not all things. And he despaired, and he made a calculation. He thought, this is the best way to have the most number of people survive. He was fooling himself, but he thought things like that. Here's another instance of how sight failed. After Saruman is defeated, Gandalf takes the Palantir that Saruman had, and then Pippin sneaks a peek into it, and he sees Sauron in the Palantir, and Sauron sees him. But because of that, Sauron actually thinks that Saruman has this hobbit, and this hobbit had the ring, and therefore Saruman now has the ring, and he's showing Sauron the hobbit who had it. So you could go back and read the dialogue there. It is amazing how Tolkien pieces together the dialogue that happened between Sauron and Saruman about it. Sauron sends a Nazgul right away to Saruman. He doesn't want to give away the fact that he suspects Saruman has the ring, and yet, you know, there's all this double entendre and double talk. But Sauron was mistaken. He was wrong. That's not what had just happened. That's not what he was seeing. Then Aragorn reveals himself to Sauron. So he is the heir of Elendil. He's the future king of Gondor and Arnor. And so the way the magic of the Palantir works is that he's actually the true user. And so Aragorn is actually able to wrest control of the Palantir from Sauron, and presents himself to Sauron. And so Sauron thinks Aragorn has now defeated Saruman, that Aragorn now has the Hobbit and the ring, and that he's going to move to strike from Minas Tirith. So Sauron again is fooled by what he sees in the Seeing Stone. Why does sight fail like this? Well, we get this especially tragic example in the person of Denethor, steward of Gondor. So Denethor also has a Palantir, and he tries to see what Sauron sees. He's a person of strong will. He has some authority to use the Palantir, but Sauron shows him the Corsair ships sailing up the Anduin River, and so these are the black ships that Sauron had thought that, oh, these are my allies. They're coming to help the orcs take over Gondor. And so Sauron wants Denethor to despair. Denethor does despair. So in that sense, Sauron is successful. Denethor despairs and then commits suicide, dies by suicide. But the irony is that the black ships are not carrying the Corsairs. They're carrying Aragorn and the Grey Company. They're on the ships because Aragorn's passed through the path of the dead. He's gotten the ghost to defeat the people from the south. So from the standpoint of the heroes, this is a complete eucatastrophe. It is an amazing, unexpected good catastrophe for Gondor that it is not the Corsairs sailing up the Anduin. And yet Denethor doesn't know that, and he despairs and dies by suicide. Then Aragorn marches on Mordor, and Sauron believes that Aragorn is deluded because he has the ring. So the interpretation that Sauron puts onto this is he must be thinking delusions of grandeur, because no one would do this unless he had the ring. The odds were about 7,000 men of Gondor, of Rohan, of a few other allies, against 10,000 orcs plus trolls and Nazgul. As Gimli said, certainty of death. And so the insanity of this persuades Sauron that Aragorn has the ring and is coming to do battle. So in Tolkien, this is why sight fails. Sight reflects a predisposition to see the world through your own pre-existing lens and not question the lens. There are a few other examples, I think, but the Palantir and the dynamics around the Seeing Stones really exemplify this, because there's no like audio interpretation that you can put on it, except for what another user wants you to know and hear, what Sauron wants you to know and hear. And so that is the problem, why sight fails. So you see things, you respond typically with despair, you forget the received morality of, look, hope, of eucatastrophe, that there are other powers at work in this world, and so you forget fellowship, standing against evil, and then you make other decisions. You make a calculation based on what you see. So you could see this in how Saruman also made decisions. For example, why didn't Saruman study hobbits? Gandalf understands why. He says, hobbits are or were no concern of his, yet he is great among the wise. He is the chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, And as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. So just pause there. The reason why Sauron knows more than Saruman, despite the fact that they're both Maiar, is because Sauron might know things of his own. I mean, he's one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful Maiar, but he also learned a lot from Melkor. It is true that Sauron and Saruman both were apprenticed to the Valar named Aule, the smith, the person, the Valar who works with earth and metals and all these things. But Sauron knew more than Saruman. There was just no way that Saruman could keep up, and that's why Saruman couldn't know how to make more rings. Gandalf says, as far as I know, there's no power in the world that knows all about hobbits, including himself, right? Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. So in many ways, studying rings and studying hobbits are completely opposite things. And for Saruman, it was totally beneath him to study hobbits. Why would I want to study these little people? They're never going to amount to much, says, he thinks. Gandalf did not. Also, why didn't Sauron suspect that anyone would destroy the rings? Gandalf says it's either despair or folly to destroy the ring. And then concludes, well, it is not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. It is wisdom to recognize necessity. The necessity is we can't keep the ring because we'll be tempted to use it, and then the Dark Lord will eventually win. The necessity here is, well, we know we can't keep it. We also know that as long as it exists, that Sauron will exist. So we might want to throw it into the ocean, but eventually, probably it's going to find its way back. The ring has some kind of agency, and Sauron will endure. So the necessity is we have to try to destroy it. So it's wisdom to recognize necessity when all other courses have been weighed, though as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope. Well, let folly be our cloak, a veil before the eyes of the enemy. In other words, it's going to look so ridiculous that we're trying to do this, that it will cloak our intentions. For he is very wise and weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure that he knows is desire for power. And so he judges all hearts. In other words, he thinks that everyone else wants power just like him. Into his heart, the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, that having the ring, we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning. And then in another place, Gandalf says, indeed, he is in great fear, not knowing what mighty one may suddenly appear, wielding the ring and assailing him with war, seeking to cast him down and take his place. So he is a little worried that Saruman would get the ring. He's worried that Gandalf would take the ring, that Galadriel would take the ring, and then unite the Ring of Power with one of the Elven rings, which had never been done before. So there are possibilities like that, and he would suffer some kind of setback or defeat, even though he would be able to return and be tethered to that ring. So he is worried about that we should wish to cast him down and have no one in his place is not a thought that occurs to his mind. That we should try to destroy the ring itself has not yet entered into his darkest dream, in which no doubt you will see our good fortune and our hope. For imagining war, he has let loose war. So he's striking out at Minas Tirith, believing that he has no time to waste, for he that strikes the first blow, if he strikes it hard enough, may need to strike no more. So the forces that he has long been preparing, he is now setting in motion sooner than he intended. Wise fool. For if he had used all his power to guard Mordor so that none could enter, and bent all his guile to the hunting of the ring, then indeed hope would have faded for us. Neither ring nor bearer could long have eluded him. but now his eye gazes abroad rather than near at home, and mostly he looks towards Minas Tirith. Very soon now, his strength will fall upon it like a storm. So that is also why Sauron doesn't suspect. What Tolkien is getting at is the issue of our biases or our prejudices make us overlook certain possibilities. And that is especially true the farther you go into evil. So here's this quote that W.H. Auden wrote in his review of The Lord of the Rings. He says, "This is why the story works. Evil, that is, has every advantage but one. It is inferior in imagination. Good can imagine the possibility of becoming evil. Hence the refusal of Gandalf and Aragorn to use the ring." In other words, they don't want to become like the Dark Lord, but evil, defiantly chosen, can no longer imagine anything but itself. This is what happens. Sauron thinks, well, everyone must be after power like mine. So those who are evil project themselves onto their opponents. And this is why Sauron cuts off or doesn't consider the possibility that someone would destroy the ring. What this shows is logically your epistemology, your way of knowing things, should come before your ethics and should shape your ethics. But unfortunately, your ethics shape and sometimes determines your epistemology. And this is where our modern day culture really has a hard time. For example, if I said, I like beer and wine, therefore Islam must be wrong, well, that seems obviously wrong when you put it that way. And because, as you may know, devout Muslims don't drink beer and wine. There's 3 verses in the Quran that talk about beer, wine, alcohol, and things like that. So if I like beer and wine, therefore Islam must be wrong. But that's putting my ethics before any other consideration of truth claims. In other words, my ethics has just shaped my epistemology. Is that a fair way to treat Islam? No, absolutely not. And yet many people would say something like this: well, I like near unlimited sexual freedom, therefore Christianity must be wrong. I mean, we see that a lot. And by the way, almost any classical belief system, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, puts some constraints around sexual freedom in a moral sense because they have a different vision of what healthy relationship is. And yet so often people say, basically, I like or I want near unlimited sexual freedom. Like maybe, okay, I can respect consent, but that's it. That should be the only limit on sexual freedom. Therefore, Christianity must be wrong. Well, that's a case of your ethics shaping your epistemology, but that is wrong. You can't make your ethics the norm and standard, the ruler for how you measure truth. You have to be willing to be told that your norm and standard were wrong. So utilitarian calculations don't work. And that is another thing that Tolkien is trying to highlight. You've heard it said, the greatest good for the greatest number, except that mathematically, we know that we can't maximize 2 variables at one time. You either have to start with the greatest good, or you start with the greatest number, and then you make a relative calculation underneath that. But you can't do 2 variables at once. Also, what is good after all? Coming through the COVID pandemic has really challenged us. What is the higher good? Is it personal freedom and liberty, or is it public health and safety? There's nothing in secular thought that tells us that. So what is the greatest good? And what is the greatest number? Who counts in that number? Do some people count more than others? Do the elderly count as much as youth? If the virus affected youth more than the elderly, we would be having very different conversations, I think. And do human beings have instrumental or intrinsic worth? In other words, is our worth dependent on what we can do, how much we make, what kind of influence we have, or is it just intrinsically worthwhile? Those are some of the problems that creep up when you're trying to use utilitarian calculations. And so Tolkien is arguing through the story that ethics are and must be deontological. In other words, they must be received, that we can't be utilitarian about it. We can't base things on calculations. And so it raises the question for us as we read Lord of the Rings and enjoy the story, and we think about the questions that it presses back on us. Is there a wisdom and a morality that we were meant to receive, live out, and pass on? If you want power and self-assertion, you will not be open to giving up power and self-sacrifice. That is the basic tension here. That's the question that everyone, the heroes, the villains, the tragic heroes in Tolkien's story has to decide. Power and self-assertion, or giving up power and self-sacrifice. And we have to be open to the idea that our precondition itself, to the extent that I put a condition on what must be true, my condition might be morally wrong, right? I mean, if I'm saying, I want beer and wine, therefore Islam must be false, that's just not a fair way to treat a belief system. We have to look at it differently. We have to evaluate the truth claims by which a belief system presents itself. And we'll get into that in future sessions. Most troubling of all, though, what if we have to account for our own personal corruption? Like, what if we're not innocent bystanders? What if we're invested? What if we have motivated reasoning? What if we have biases? Put it this way in terms of the story. Why were even hobbits vulnerable to the ring? Yes, they were stronger than others, but in the end, they were vulnerable. Why were Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam invited to the Undying Lands in order to be healed? Yes, even Sam, even for the brief time that he took the ring, actually was wounded. And he knew that, but he was able to hang on a little bit in Middle-earth. And so what if we are not neutral observers of good and evil? What if there's something that the ring, whatever the ring represents to us, power, control over others, control over our circumstances, what if it hooks into something in us? And all of Tolkien's peers were wrestling with this question. How do we know what is the right thing to do? Why is that? Well, it's because there were developments in the 1800s and 1900s that pressed this question. Either it was the growth of the state and the question of, well, who has rights? Who has the right to control this or that? Who has the power to make the laws? Or it was war, and especially around World War I and World War II. So you see great authors with great works wrestling with these questions. This is where Dostoevsky writes The Brothers Karamazov. Lord Acton says, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Absolutely. You have George Orwell in Animal Farm, William Golding, The Lord of the Flies, T.H. White, The Once and Future King, Kurt Vonnegut, Billy Slaughterhouse-Five, Ursula K. Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Tolkien is among those who are looking at World War I and II and saying this was devastating. And how did people believe that these were the right things to do? When we look at the biblical story, this raises the question for us. In Genesis 2-4, you have a portrayal of human beings taking from God the prerogative to define good and evil. How do we see that? Well, you see that humans internalize the desire and power to define good and evil. So in the garden, there are two trees, tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why is that? Because in relation to us, it would seem God is a life giver and a lawgiver, and his law-giving serves his life-giving. In other words, we're intended to trust him with the definition of good and evil and say, I'll put my back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in trust, not out of a rejection, but in trust that God is defining it. I'm not supposed to take this into myself. I'm supposed to actually look at the tree of life and walk towards it in trust, trusting that God has more life for me, more love for me, more goodness for all of us, more shalom, more ability to spread the garden over the wild creation, more beauty, order. But human beings did not do that. Of course, we know in Genesis 3 that Adam and Eve took and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And from that point on, human beings have wanted to define it from within ourselves for ourselves. And Genesis 4 is also part of that. And typically it's not seen as a further fall or a continuation of the fall from many interpreters, but it really is that. And how do we know that? It's because if you compare Genesis 3 and 4 and the characters Adam and Eve to Cain, you see that Cain does not need an external voice of temptation. Adam and Eve did. Cain has internalized a voice of temptation. Cain's blame shifting is far worse than Adam's. Cain's self-corruption intensifies because God says to him, the land will not yield its fruit for you. It's not that Cain damaged the land kind of in a carte blanche way. It's that he damaged it for himself. In other words, he really corrupted something in himself. When he killed Abel, he damaged himself. And Cain's alienation from people and land intensifies. So it's worse than where Adam and Eve were at. At least Adam and Eve could still cultivate, they can cultivate a field. Cain could not. He had to wander. What he winds up doing is actually making his son build a city and protect him and farm and justify him and defend him and all these things. How do we know that? It's because Cain named his city after his son Enoch. And then you start to see human beings redefining very important words. So God promised to protect Cain. He says, whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. That was like, we don't know exactly how that would play out. It was a promise. And Lamech, apparently, one of the descendants of Cain knows about this saying, and then he uses it as a promise to protect himself. Like he becomes his own judge, jury, executioner. In fact, he already killed someone who struck him. And so he uses it to say, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So he's totally taking this into his own hands. So the biblical portrayal is that we become relativistic absolutists and absolutist relativists. Isaiah says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. In other words, we just define these things around what's convenient for us, right? I mean, we say, well, evil, sure, it exists. What Hitler did was evil. What Putin's doing is evil. And it's evil to break up with someone and then date someone the next day, except when I do it, right? Like when I do it, it's okay. That's the whole thing. We use terms like good and evil, which are absolutes, and yet we treat them relativistically. And then we are really dogmatic about our ability to define them. In the end, our human nature is shown to be corrupt. God made it originally good with good desires. Adam and Eve corrupted it. We do things that make it worse, and God can heal it, but only with our partnership, because he has come in the person of Jesus to take on a human nature and heal it. There was a preliminary way that God had called Israel to be like a medical focus group to try to take in the really demanding health regimen and cut away the thing in our human nature that shouldn't be there. But they couldn't do it. And so Jesus brought that vocation to a climax, to a culmination point, and he was able to cut away and burn away something in his own human nature that should never have been there. He killed the thing that was killing us. He shared in our broken humanity that we might share in his healed humanity. So if the human problem is internal to each of us and not simply external, then there's a whole bunch of questions that we need to ask, right? Like, number one, is there a God good enough and personal enough to heal human nature? Number two, has any other tradition developed a new healed human nature? Are there any other possible solutions? Number three, what's the evidence for the solution, for any solution like that, or for that specific God? And number four, and most importantly, are we open to fairly deep change, including resisting the desire to define good and evil on our own, resisting the desire to just calculate things, as opposed to, say, receive a moral vision and moral direction from beyond ourselves in a way that resonates with things in us, that we do desire that which is good and just and beautiful and true. And yet sometimes we don't totally know what that is. We are still dependent on someone else, namely a God, to tell us that. And so is there a good and personal God? And is there an original wisdom and moral vision to be received? huge questions. Once again, Tolkien is really gesturing at that, because one of his purposes in writing is to gesture towards a possibility for why the Angles, the English people, became Christian relatively quickly. Again, one of his purposes in writing was to explore what a pre-Christian English literature looked like, because Beowulf was the earliest Christian literature, the earliest English literature. It's already Christian or Christianized. It has Christian influences. And so he was trying to say, well, there must have been a literature before Beowulf and before Christian faith got to the Angles in the person of Augustine of Canterbury in 597 AD. And so he was trying to imagine the earliest Christian mission to the Angles. And he was saying, well, there's a way in which these stories that we love and that we deeply respect resonates and with things in us and prepares us to understand Jesus and the claims that he made. And so, as we talked about in previous videos, the story of Jesus is like the story of the Lord of the Rings, in the sense that when Jesus comes and takes on a human nature, it is like Frodo at Rivendell saying, I will take the ring, deciding to try to destroy it. Jesus says, I will take this thing and the corruption of sin that's in human nature and destroy it. And we talked about how that happens on December 25th. When does Frodo leave Rivendell? December 25th. That is Christmas. That is the day Jesus was born. So the symmetry is intentional. And then Jesus says, I will resist the ring, or I will resist the corruption in human nature. Just like Gandalf, Aragorn, Galadriel, and Frodo said, I will resist the ring. Frodo said, I will destroy the ring. And he did not succeed. But Jesus said, I will destroy the corruption of sin. And he did succeed. He returns in his resurrection and says, I am who you should have been. So yes, Frodo failed to destroy the ring. Absolutely. But that's part of the point. The point is, in The Lord of the Rings, no one was strong enough to overcome whatever flaw is in human nature that we have. Jesus says, it can be conquered. You can be cured by me. The story fills full an earlier story. The Christian story fills full an earlier story in which it was said, this is the great hope, that Eru himself will enter into Arda and heal men and all the marring. It's what Irenaeus of Lyon said, an unlooked for thing which could have been accomplished in no other way than by God, the Lord of all, an unlooked for salvation. Because are we not hoping that there is a good God who will triumph over evil and will do so without becoming evil himself? In the creation story of the Silmarillion, remember how this played out in the form of song. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow. This is the music of Eru and the Valar singing that gives the history of the world and human history a basic shape. And this is what Melkor tried to overcome. Melkor, through his music, sang in this way. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. Again, I think the framework of music is a beautiful one and a really good one to say there can be an original musician who is good and allows and calls for participation. There can be renegade musicians who try to do what Melkor did, but the master musician is so good that he can play a melody, orchestrate a symphony that captures the dissonance and brings it back to a resolution. The story of Jesus told in Scripture is a story that fills full the greatest stories that we've ever had, that we've ever longed for to be true. And so that is one of the things that we have to consider here. So for discussion and reflection, again, you may be using this just for enjoyment or for personal reflection, maybe even like a small group conversation. And if you are, here are some questions that strike me. Again, we've named some of them before. Number one, has any other tradition developed a new healed human nature, or talk about that? Are there any other possible solutions for bringing shalom back, bringing healing back, restoring that which is good, and not just collapsing it back into evil? Are there any other possible solutions for how good can overcome evil without becoming evil itself? Number two, what's the evidence for the solution? In Christian faith, it's the historicity of Jesus, that he was a historical figure, that he really lived in our history, that he died and rose again. That's the evidence. Also, part of it is the history of Israel, that there is an Israel, and that they were very different people, very unusual people. What is the evidence that other belief systems present to you? Again, because you can't just say, well, I like beer and wine, therefore Islam must be wrong. We have to look at belief systems in a fair way and say, well, what is it presenting me with that I might evaluate it? You might as well start with Jesus. But we can ask this question, and we really ought to ask the question for any belief system. Is there a way that other belief systems invite us to evaluate it? What's the evidence for that specific God? And number three, are we open to fairly deep change, including resisting the desire to define good and evil on our own? What if that's the very thing that we're being asked to give back? What if there's a greater moral vision and a greater story that we're called to enter, to be part of, to participate in? I want to thank you again for watching and listening, and we'll see you in the next video where we look at some of Tolkien's political vision. What is his vision for leadership, and deeper questions about power? See you in the next video.